what I want to do in this video is a little bit of 1960s U.S. economic history, and then just see if our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model fits the description of what actually happened. And one could argue you don't need the ADAS model to describe what happened, but we should at least make sure that it does describe what happened. So if we go to 1960, so 1960, this is the very end of the Eisenhower administration. Eisenhower was a Republican in office. And the only reason why I give his party affiliation is because if the economy is weak, and in 1960 the economy was weak, and one can always debate whether it was due to the government or whether it was due to just the natural fluctuations in the economy, but in general, when the economy is weak, it tends to go against the party that is in power. And so in 1960, the Republicans were in power, there was a recession, and one could argue that was a major reason why the Democratic candidate in the 1960 election was able to win, John F. Kennedy. And so in 1961, JFK is inaugurated. He becomes President of the United States. And one of his top goals is to try to turn around this economy. And he does it with what can best be described as Keynesian policies, and we'll talk more about that in future videos. In fact, I should probably devote many videos to Keynesian policies. But it's a general idea that the government might be able to turn around a recession by sparking demand, and the way that it would spark demand is try to put more money in people's pockets or even in businesses' pockets, and it would do that through some combination of increased government spending, maybe somehow giving money to the poor, some types of transfer programs, and tax cuts for people and for businesses so that they have more money to spend. And so these policies get implemented, and over John F. Kennedy's term, you do have GDP begins to turn back around, unemployment, so I'll just write employment goes up, and inflation stays low. Inflation is low. So these are all of the things that you want in an economy. And unfortunately, and this is just kind of a sad human event, in 1963, John F. Kennedy, you probably know, is assassinated. And then his vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, that is LBJ right over there, Lyndon Baines Johnson becomes president. LBJ becomes president. A little bit of trivia. He's tied for the tallest president in U.S. history, tied with Abraham Lincoln at 6'4". And so he inherits a very, very good economy. Almost, one could argue, a perfect economy. And if Keynesian policies were really to be practiced here to their full idea, in theory, once the economy started to get a little bit really overheated and really approaching its potential in maybe 1964 and 1965, the government maybe should have started to pull back a little bit on its spending so that the economy doesn't get overheated. But Lyndon Baines Johnson did not do this. He kept things going, and in fact, he added more fuel to the fire, and one could argue that some of it was driven by geopolitics. A major factor was right over here, the Vietnam War, which was escalated in a major way under LBJ's administration. JFK was already dabbling in Vietnam, but it became really a major war for the United States under Lyndon Baines Johnson. So some combination of Vietnam, and he had and he had a huge number of social programs, increased government spending, to try to ease inequality in the U.S. as well. So social programs, so one could call guns and butter, social programs to try to ease inequality. But the net effect of this is government spending. Even though the economy was already red hot, it was already at its potential, he wanted to increase government spending even more, and so he kind of took it beyond its potential. He made it overheat a little bit. And what happens in 1966 and onwards is that you have inflation starting to grow at a fairly uncomfortable rate. Inflation starts to grow dramatically. And just to get a sense of it, when I keep saying that the economy was at its potential, and maybe he might have taken a little bit of his pedal off the gas, or his foot off of the pedal, I should say, is as we get into the beginning of his administration, 1964, 1965, unemployment is in the 4-5% range. Inflation is in the 1-2% range. GDP is growing at a very healthy rate. But despite that, and maybe he was, he could argue maybe his hand was forced by geopolitical events, especially on military funding, the government continues to even spend more money, stimulates things even more, because that money goes to soldier salaries, it goes to companies that provide, I guess, that make napalm or make boats or make whatever else, and so you get more, and all of these government programs inject even more dollars into the economy, and so you ended up with inflation. The economy was already operating at close to capacity, and it made it go maybe even beyond its natural capacity. And let's see whether our ADAS model would allow for this to happen, or would describe this, or would predict this given what was going on. So let's draw. So that right over there is my price axis, and this right over here is my real GDP axis. Let me scroll down a little bit. This right over here is real GDP. And so if we go into the 1964-1965 time frame, you could say that the U.S. is performing at its potential GDP. Its potential GDP. And when I talk about its potential GDP, I'm saying that on the long run, assuming that people aren't overworked, assuming that factories, they're getting their proper maintenance, they're not being kind of run so hard that they start, kind of cracking at the seams, this is how much that the U.S. can produce. In theory, if everyone worked even harder and didn't sleep and were doing things in an unsustainable way, they might even be able to produce more. One could view this as a theoretical maximum. But when we talk about potential, we're not talking about that short-term theoretical maximum. We're talking about the maximum GDP that a economy can produce, I guess you could say, in a healthy way, or over the long run, assuming that people aren't overworked and that the factories aren't overworked in some way, shape, or form. So this could be our situation maybe in 1964, 1965. Let's draw, and maybe this right over here is the level of prices, because we just want to see if in general we get this type of thing happening from our model. So this is our aggregate supply in the long run. Our aggregate supply in the short run, we know, might look something like, aggregate supply in the short run might look something like this. So that's aggregate supply in the short run. And then from our model, we will assume, let me draw that a little bit neater, just so it intersects a little bit better. So this right over here is aggregate. Let me draw a little bit better than that. I want the slope. So this is our aggregate supply in the short run. So aggregate supply in the short run. And let's draw our aggregate demand. Aggregate demand. And I'll do that in this green color. So aggregate demand might look something like that. So that is our aggregate demand. So this is 1964, 1965. Here we are. The economy is humming along at its potential. Now more gas is thrown on the flame. Government accelerates its spending, not just to turn on the economy now because of Vietnam and all of these social programs. So what's going to happen? Well, that money is ending up in company and people's pockets. They are going to demand more. It's going to shift the demand curve to the right. At any given price, they are going to demand more. So aggregate demand is going to shift to the right, and maybe it shifts to the right, and maybe it goes someplace right over there. So what is the new short-term equilibrium? Well, aggregate demand is intersecting aggregate supply right over here, right over there, and as we see, the equilibrium level of prices on this model now has gone up. Our productivity, we're now producing above potential. We're overheating a little bit. And actually, if you look at the data in 1966, 1967, unemployment did become ridiculously low. It even it got in kind of the 3-point-something% for a little while. So really, and many people would argue that even now, that is an unnaturally low level of unemployment. That people and factories are really operating at maybe beyond full capacity, or beyond a sustainable full capacity. But we see from this model what you think would happen actually does happen. Prices would go up, and right over there. And then on the long run, you really wouldn't be able to sustain this level of producing above your potential, and over the long run, things would settle back right over here, and all you're left with really is the inflation.